Views and opinions on this part of the bill.
Chairman.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. When I came down to the House today, I looked at the order paper and we had 12 hours and 2 minutes remaining of the budget debate. And here we are just a couple of hours later, having switched not to the next bill on the order paper, but the one after it, because the government seems to be in a state of disarray today.
No, they've done the other.
What's that?
They did the Crown Entities.
They did the Crown Entities bill. Committee stage went through very fast, did it? Or, well, I might be mistaken, but I didn't think. We did it very quickly. Well, Mr Speaker, the first mistake that we had for Jerry Brownlee today was when he came down here to speak in the budget debate, and having been responsible for the order paper that said that the adjournment motion was in the name of David Shearer, he said it was in the name of Grant Robertson about 3 or 4 times until Mr Joyce sort of, with some embarrassment, whispered into his ear he had that one wrong. And then, of course, we a touch of the Banksies. That's right, a touch of the Banksies. And then we had some debate around the budget, and it was obvious that the debate was about to turn to vote education and the terrible debacle that there has been for the government around intermediate schools. And lo and behold, all of a sudden we had an adjournment motion on the budget debate with many, many hours remaining in that budget debate. It was not convenient for the government to continue because they had to come to these other urgent pieces of legislation which have been languished. Well, that's right. This one was introduced originally by the Honourable Leanne Dalzell in the last Labor government. It then languished at select committee for some time because there was more under the chairpersonship of Leanne Dalzell, because there was some more pressing and important business before the committee to attend to first. And then, having been back here since November 2010, they let it languish on the order paper until today, because those. In fact, I have heard that they've been hurting so much that the Prime Minister's emissaries have been around the gallery today blaming Hekia Parata. Collective responsibility is not really. I'm being told that we should be addressing part.
Point of order, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Are we interjecting on points of order now?
Point of order, the Honourable Clayton
Cosgrove. Sir, with respect, not challenging your ruling, but the Minister in his address did actually say that he was going to, and fair enough too, he was wandering slightly wide of Part 1 to address some other issues, which in fairness the Minister I think were valid, but if that same leniency is going to be extended to Ministers, it should be extended to those on the side of the House.
I have given the Speaker 2.5 minutes of talking about other things other than Part 1. I've asked him to come to Part 1, and I know he's going to. Yep. Part 1, the Honourable David.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. That is a fair point, and I will come back to the bill. Mr Chairman, this bill allows the Commerce Commission to share information if there was an inquiry being conducted in one country or another into, for example, the efficiency of provision of education. And if there was said to be some anti-competitive practice at large, anti-competitive practice, it could have been, whether charter schools were cooperating amongst themselves that were in a way that was anti-competitive, or it would be interesting to know from the Minister whether, if the Crown was engaged in some anti-competitive procedure that was affecting school conduct. For example, if they were to try to tell all of the intermediates in the whole of the country that they should close down their technology suites. Mr Chairman, this is within order. I am asking whether it would be, if the Crown was to give a direction to all of the schools, whether they would be caught by the inquiry functions that are being extended in this legislation for the Commerce Commission. Because I'm not sure on my reading of this legislation whether it applies only to private enterprise actions like charter schools, or whether it would apply to Crown actions where a minister or government silly enough to tell schools that they had to change student ratios in a way that effectively required, and I want the Minister to take a call as to whether that sort of conduct on the part of the Crown would be caught by these investigative functions that could now cooperate and get lessons from Australia, as to whether they've ever been silly enough to give a direction to their intermediate schools in a way that would close down all of their technology. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I am interested in the Minister and the Chair taking a call and answering that question. I'm also interested in another matter. Mr. Chairman, at times we have regulated monopolies in New Zealand, including in respective lines, electricity lines. There is an unclear point in New Zealand as to whether the input methodologies, Mr. Chairman, whether the input methodologies that are relied upon to set the prices for lines are right in New Zealand. And it's a hot debate. It's going on appeal at the moment. And Vector would say that the Commerce Commission in New Zealand is allowing them a lower cost of capital than is allowed in Australia. What does the Minister think? And I would be interested to know what the Minister thinks of that. And I would also be interested to know what the Minister thinks as to what are the consequences of that for the regulated monopoly. And I'll tell you why I'm interested, because I've been told that the consequences of that for Vector are worth between $400 and $700 million. Between $400 and $700 million. And we could benefit with cooperation with Australian authorities as to what they think is the right answer to that.
To Sky City Casino.
Well, that's the exact point I was going to make, Mr. Cunliffe, because you know, if it's strange you should mention that, because if rather than pinging them on their interest, their return on capital, they were to say, oh, to Vector, well, HE, why don't we give you the same rate of return as they have in Australia, and you buy us you build us a convention centre, and we might get a convention centre cheaper than Sky City are willing to do with it, without the adverse effects of the pokie machines. So, Mr. Chairman, it would be interesting if the Minister could respond as to whether this sharing of information between regulators on both sides of the Tasman, in this case, could actually turn up some information to show whether that decision by the government, which in respect of the Sky City Casino, isn't really as silly as it appears from the outside. .com, that's right. Well, look, the police seem willing to share his computers, so maybe this is just another example of sharing of information. Mr. Speaker, there's one other serious question I would like to raise, and that is, what controls are there going to be against the inappropriate sharing of information? Because I wouldn't want to see information being shared, for example, in relation to telecommunication companies with some countries that don't have proper checks and balances and the protection of civil liberties of their people in their countries. I think we have to be a bit careful. What's that? Not naming any other than Fiji, perhaps, that I would name as a close neighbour with whom we shouldn't be sharing information on some of these matters. So, Mr. Chairman, I've raised a number of questions. I'm actually particularly interested in the point as to whether there could be a sharing of information as to, and whether this would apply to decisions of the Crown as effectively a monopoly purchaser of education services, whether if they make some ridiculous decision that would effectively cut technology classes out of all schools, whether that sort of thing could be the subject of an inquiry by the Commerce Commission for the purposes of which they could gather information or share information with the Australian regulator. That seems to be the most practical instance that we have recently of some monopoly or monopsonist practice that has terribly adverse effects and which there needs to be an inquiry about.
I call out Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take a